Well, there's a lot of con in Centauri. I don't think anyone's ever portrayed an outer space con man yet.
All day long, isn't it, Robert?
Mm-hmm. Getting it over with.
You're gonna carry him out?
Well, I'm gonna walk him out, yeah. There's no more cables or anything, Press. You just have to get in the car.
Nick Castle started his film career on a writing level. His first noted involvement in film was as a cinematographer for a USC film called The Resurrection of Bronco Billy. Nick added story elements to the film alongside his buddy John Carpenter, who made the music and edited the film.
Morning, Bill. Putting the rent in the mailbox?
Morning, Mrs. Castle.
2 weeks overdue, you know.
John and Nick were close during their college years, and they even had a band together called the Coupe de Villes that consisted of John Carpenter, Nick Castle, and Tommy Lee Wallace. The band would go on to make a couple of albums, but is most known for the theme to Big Trouble in Little China, which we will cover someday here. Those close to Nick often described him as a goofball who was warm and funny, and that is one of the reasons Castle leaned more towards comedy in his films rather than horror. I didn't have any kind of secret glee or something that I somehow playing both sides of the line of entertainment here. You know, like comedy and horror. And my horror experiences, you may know, it was pretty much a fluke, so I guess I gravitated towards the light side. With Nick and John Carpenter being close friends, Nick was there to help his buddy when he decided to go after Dark Star. Like Nick would later do for Halloween, Nick played the troublemaker in Dark Star, which was an alien beach ball that actually tried to push a member of the ship's crew down an elevator shaft. After Halloween, he worked as a writer on several projects, including Escape from New York, until he finally got his big break to direct the movie Tag, the assassination game, with Robert Carradine, Michael Winslow, and Linda Hamilton in her first theatrical role. The film was not that successful, but he now had a film under his belt. This experience would lead him to his next film, The Last Starfighter. The Last Starfighter came from the mind of Jonathan Betuel. Jonathan was a junior copywriter in an advertising agency in New York. He dabbled in writing, and one day he wandered into a local arcade during his lunch break and saw a boy playing an arcade game. At that time, he was reading The Once and Future King, and it was then he had an idea.
It suddenly occurred to me, in a bolt from the blue or whatever, what if a video game was like a sword in the stone? And the boy pulled the sword from the stone, and some boy scored an incredible number on this video game, and it sent out a ripple effect across the universe.
The spec script was sent out by an agent representing Jonathan, and time would pass. Jonathan found himself in a new job as a cab driver when his agent finally called him and said Lorimar Pictures was interested in his script, which was originally called Starfighter. At the time, Lorimar was best known for television, like 8 is Enough and Dallas. Starfighter was already being developed as Digital Productions was already hired for the effects. Budget talks had also been addressed, and a producer named Gary Adelson was attached to it. Adelson was screening directors, but none seemed right. But then, Nick fell into place. His manager gave the script to Nick, and although he thought the script needed work, he liked the idea. So Nick reached out to the producer. The two got along well and began discussing the movie, and Nick had a lot of ideas about it. Soon, Jonathan was summoned from New York to become a full-time screenwriter so they could hash out the project. The obvious worry was that the audience would equate Last Starfighter to Star Wars or even a Spielberg film, because originally the movie was set in a Spielberg-esque suburban environment. One of my early ideas was to set it in a trailer park to isolate the main character to make his life more difficult than if he was in the suburbs. Everyone collaborated well, and there was a lot of synergy. A perfect example of this was when Nick Castle was approached by Jonathan when he came up with this. Nick, listen to this. The Music Man in Outer Space. Nick thought about it, and it clicked quickly. They began rewriting the script to fit the actor. Later, Castle would recall,
and we just, all of us turned and went, we have to get that guy. We have to get Robert Preston. And in fact, when Jonathan came up with the idea, we started to rewrite the character.
When The Last Starfighter started to gel, casting began, and while this occurred, Ron Cobb went scouting for locations, and it was he who found the trailer park site and the store called Rio, located in Canyon Country, South California. For Alex Rogan, Lance Guest was always high on the casting list. Lance was best known for his role as Jimmy in Halloween 2 and a Neil Simon film called I Ought to Be in Pictures. What Lance didn't know during the early 80s was that Nick Castle visited John Carpenter while he was doing some editing of Halloween 2. Nick saw Lance in some of the footage and asked about him. Nick was currently working on Tag, the assassination game that took place in a college, and he mused that he was looking for actors like him. Nick remembered Lance when Last Starfighter was in the works, and thus his agent was set the script. Castle stated that Guest reminded him of Jimmy Stewart or Henry Fonda, and that felt right for the part. Lance stated he read for a part from the script titled Centauri's Recruit, which was a fake name for the production since the studio was worried about anything with the word star in it because they worried Lucasfilm would cause trouble if it sounded too much like Star Wars. After reading for the part, Lance thought he didn't get it, and after 2 months passed, he got a call to return. When he returned, there were 3 males and 3 females currently in the lead for the parts of Alex and Maggie. The most important casting desire for Maggie was someone who could pass for the girl next door. They didn't want a supermodel or anything like that, just a down-to-earth girl who was trepidatious to move on from her home, and Catherine Mary Stewart fit that bill. At the time she was auditioning for The Last Starfighter, she was working on the soap opera Days of Our Lives. Up to that point, Stewart had played in some small films, and one big one with a small part. After Starfighter, she would appear in the cult classic Night of the Comet, and later, Weekend at Bernie's.
It's just Bernie!
Serendipitously, when it came time for Catherine and Lance to do callbacks, they were paired together, taken to a room, and had to read for their parts. Before they performed, Stewart recalled that Lance was very serious about getting the part. In the reading, Castle was there, the producer, and some studio folks. Their chemistry and appearance had a lot going for it, and they worked well. And what was more appealing to those in charge was that they were not as known and therefore cheaper than some of the others trying out for the film, because it is noted that some of the running members were part of the Brat Pack from the 80s. As to which Brat Pack people were up for the part, I could not discover, as Catherine Mary Stewart was on record stating that members of the Brat Pack tried for this film and were some of the last runner-ups for the parts. So if you know any, please let us know in the comments, because I'm curious about this. Now, we do know one of the runner-ups for Alex was none other than Peter Nelson from the miniseries V. Though he did not win the part of Alex Rogan, he was given the role as Jack Blake, the rich kid with everything. Later, Nelson would become a film producer. Robert Preston was cast as Centauri, and it was his last theatrical appearance before his death 3 years later on March 21st, 1987, of lung cancer. During filming, Preston loved what he did and enjoyed being on camera. Dan O'Herlihy was a big star by 1984 and had been in over 40 movies with an Academy Award nomination under his belt. We got lucky with the cast. The chemistry of the whole thing wound up making sense, with 2 handsome leads without being over the top, and talk about being a trooper. Dan had to be in that alien mask that was stuck to him with some kind of glue. I remember him talking about manipulating the mask in front of the mirror so he could see how much character he could give it. The Last Starfighter was shot in 38 days, and it was filmed during May 1983. This was verified by Castle, who stated the shooting schedule was around 40 days. Because the speed of the shoot was so fast, Lance Guest was often worried about his performance because they only allowed just 2 or 3 takes before they moved to another shot. There was no time for experimentation, so Lance would often rehearse with other performers to have his performance down before the camera rolled. One particular instance was around 3 in the morning, and Lance went to Robert Preston's trailer asking if they could go over a scene. Preston was joyful and responded, "Sure, kid." Now, if you're the type of person who can't stand dated effects, then this film will most likely not work for you. But if you are interested in characters and story, it will. The effects for the time were unique, and they did stand out as a milestone for cinema in 1984. It was the first film to ever make photorealistic simulations on a large scale that looks like it's in the camera. And that alone gives this film points for originality and a daring approach. I remember when I saw this for the first time, and I thought the effects looked odd, as I had felt with Tron. But in 1984, we never saw any digital effects to this level before in a movie. We had seen CGI in commercials and some small films, but never interwoven like it was done in Starfighter. Of course, there was Tron, which was a masterful achievement, but this looked entirely different. It was like seeing Toy Story for the first time in 1993, before computer animation was the norm. They made a huge effort for this film, and it changed the boundaries of computer use in cinema for years to come. The effects themselves were done using a Cray XMP supercomputer, and it had a whopping 2 gigabytes of memory, and Digital Productions used the most pioneering tech to make integrated computer graphics. This hadn't been done to this extent at all. There had been some practice work done to make something look like a digital ship, but to maneuver it and to do it within scenes, it was all research and development as we were making the movie. It took almost another year after we'd finished principal photography to do it. I was there pretty much every day, signing off on shots and working with Ron and the visual effects team. Everything was being invented for digital movie making at that place at that time. It was interesting and always fraught with danger. During filming and post, Nick had no special effects expertise at all, and so he leaned heavily on Ron Cobb for help and understanding. Ron was like a second director on this picture. He was the one who knew science fiction. Essentially, this was a big gamble on the studio's part. Kudos have to be given to Lorimar Pictures because it was a risk. These effects had never been done before, and had it been a bigger studio, chances are they wouldn't have backed the effects company because all this was completely unknown territory. Midway through the process, it was calculated that the effects would take 17 more months to finish, and they only had half that time. Gary Adelson was told they could fire Digital Productions and get another effects house if they moved quickly. But the producer stood fast.
Jeff Oken came into my office one time, we were about halfway through, and said, "It can't be done. We're not going to do it. We're not going to make it. We're not going to make it in time, and the special effects are just not going to work."
I have 3 model companies standing by. I can get all these sequences shot the way that you boarded them and delivered in 5 months without increasing your budget. All you have to do is fire Digital Productions.
So I basically just said to Jeff, "Go back. It's going to work. Go back and make it work." And I never want to hear you say that again.
Digital Productions did everything they could, hiring more people, training them, and lots of overtime, sometimes to the point that committed workers would sleep in the office.
I remember sleeping on the bench of the Cray, and I wasn't the only one. There were a lot of late hours, a lot of long hours, people just cranking away trying to make sure everything came out.
The approach to Digital Productions was really impressive of Adelson because this was his first theatrical producing gig, and he did not buckle under pressure and stood by his people, something that is not common in Hollywood. To get everything done in time, some of the effects needed to be softened, and a perfect example of this is when the Gunstar goes in the cave. Many shadows were added to hide the texture of the cave walls, and when the walls were seen, there was a milky smooth texture to them. Now, when the film was greenlit, Robert Remy was the president of theatrical releases at Universal. But in December 1983, he left the company. A new chairman came to Universal named Frank Price, and Price wanted to see this new film with new talent. In the past, Price worked at Columbia Pictures, and the way he was known to work was to hire big-name talent like Steven Spielberg for Close Encounters and bank on big names to sell tickets. The Last Starfighter had no names, and when he took over the company, he wanted to know what the heck this movie was he inherited. So during December 1983, or very early 1984, he was shown a test screening for the film, and it was long before any of the effects were fully realized. Gary Adelson stated the effects still looked like cartoons.
And so Nick and I went into the studio. We screened the cut of the movie. The movie ended. Total silence. Frank got up, kind of nodded his head at us, and walked out the door. And we knew at that time we were going to get we knew he felt he'd inherited a disaster and that we would get no real support from the studio.
But the film moved forward despite Price, not only because Adelson politicked well, but because Lorimar Pictures was invested and behind the film. When the test screening phase of the film began, it was mainly to see how audiences reacted to the effects, but they soon discovered that folks really liked the Beta character in the film. So this led to some reshoots, as more scenes were created to expand on the character and the humor in the film. These reshoots occurred in March 1984. You can identify these scenes by Lance Guest's wig, and at the time, he was very sick during these reshoots. Most notably is the scene when he's in the truck and he looks pale. While filming this scene, he was noted to have a fever of over 100. For the score, Nick turned to Craig Safan, who he was familiar with because he scored his first film, Tag, the assassination game. Craig started out writing songs for musicians in Los Angeles, and it was there he worked alongside Peter Bernstein. It would be Peter's father, Elmer Bernstein, the composer, who recommended Craig to Nick Castle for Tag. While Craig was composing, most of the film's effects were not finished, and therefore Nick had to describe the scenes to him so he could visualize and time his composures.
So I would see a dot, like a white dot, and then maybe a white square, and Nick would be standing over my shoulder.
He was given ideas of what was happening, and blank cards went in those places for him to score. But actually, I got to talk him through what was happening and what I thought it would look like.
When the film was released, Universal did not go out of its way to promote the film. With the head of Universal not excited about it, there was no priority. And truthfully, Price did not know what kind of film he had on his hands. Had he known with the right marketing, this film could have made a bigger impact upon its release. But alas, things just didn't seem to work out for this film, and this included the merchandising. This started with the official video game for the film. Atari was working on a game during 1983, but then the video game crash of 1983 happened, and production for the game to be released alongside the film crashed to a halt. So this game never made it to Atari 5200 consoles. It would later be remade as Star Raider 2 with changes. An arcade cabinet was also attempted, but it only got to 75% completion before the film came out. But a completed cabinet was estimated to cost $10,000 for arcades, and Atari bigwigs worried it was too expensive to release, so they dumped it and took a tax write-off. The cabinet game was unique for the time, as the graphics were more solid and shaded, giving it more real texture. You can see this with the actual footage of the game here. Later, we would see a game for the movie realized in the summer of 1990 for the Nintendo Entertainment System, which was unfortunately just a copy of the game Uridium. And I am showing you the footage of the game side by side so you can see the similarity. It's too bad the game was not given a unique approach, but it's the best we ever got for an official game for this movie. Later, fans would make their own Starfighter games. The Last Starfighter Starfighter tried to get other merchandise released, and figures were designed for the film, though they were not fully realized until Galoob stepped in and made 12 really cool-looking figures for the film. They even got so far as to design packaging, which consisted of 2-packs, but the figures never made it to retail because the film didn't meet the desired success, which is a shame. What did make it to stores was the Last Starfighter Combat board game and 3 issues of a Marvel Comics series that were the official adaptations for the film. There were t-shirts, a score, which was a must-buy, a storybook, and a novelization by Alan Dean Foster. The landscape of cinema during the summer of 1984 was extremely healthy and competitive. Currently, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, Gremlins, Ghostbusters, and The Karate Kid were champions of the box office. The newest releases for audiences' attention were on June 29th, 1984, and it had Arnold Schwarzenegger returning as Conan the Destroyer, and the crazy cast of Cannonball Run returned for a second outing, and Tom Hanks tried to remain pure for his marriage despite peer pressure in Bachelor Party. When The Last Starfighter was released, it had a nice window. The week before, there were no new films in theaters. So on July 13th, 1984, The Last Starfighter was released alongside The Muppets Take Manhattan. Starfighter did great in its first week, ranking in 9 million and ranking 3rd behind Gremlins and Ghostbusters. But on July 20th, there were a ton of releases flooding the market. The disappointing Best Defense was touted as the new Eddie Murphy film, even though he was just a side character in it. Then there was Electric Dreams, about a computer that becomes sentient and in love. The 2 big movies that took audiences away from The Last Starfighter were definitely The Never-Ending Story, which had a family adventure vibe, and alongside it was a film nerds who love science fiction would definitely appreciate called Revenge of the Nerds, which made a healthy $40.8 million. On July 27th, 1984, Prince made his film debut in Purple Rain. And I remember this film being a big deal for the culture in 1984 alongside his album. Everyone was playing the Purple Rain album, and many in my schools were wearing Prince t-shirts. Meatballs 2 also released, and although it's corny, I still have fondness for this one.
Flash, why are you a dork? Are you for real?
With all this competition, The Last Starfighter really struggled to remain a contender. During the week of August 3rd, 1984, Starfighter continued to struggle. When The Bostonians, Grandview USA, The Joy of Sex, and The Philadelphia Experiment came out, there just wasn't enough room in theaters to keep older films that were not making bank when 4 or 5 films were released weekly at this time. And The Last Starfighter would suffer as a casualty because of that. During the week of August 10th, Starfighter would limp along in the 13th spot, while the new releases Red Dawn and Cloak and Dagger would finally push it out of theaters in most cases. The Last Starfighter wasn't a failure, though. It racked up a tally of $28.7 million. With a budget of $15 million, that made it a great success for Lorimar, and critical reaction to the film was very good. But that didn't mean everyone liked it.
This film, I think, is so much better. It's so much better looking, so much more adult and crisp, and characters that you can
and so
relate
much
to.
more original for anyone who's never seen a Star Wars picture.
You can't always agree with every movie. This is just another example of how folks see movies differently, and we love it. However, we will cover the movie and our view on it in the next video. I sure do wish The Last Starfighter was more popular in 1984, but the competition was just too strong, and the awareness was not there. I bet every time the makers think of the competition at that time, I bet they wish something like this happened.
Yeah! You're a little too heavy, buddy. Yeah! We're going down. Yeah!
We will see you next time. If you like what you see here, click like and subscribe. Super thanks helps a ton, and sharing helps just as much.